there, my name is Jane Freeman. I am a postpartum doula specializing in mood disorders, mood disorder prevention to be more specific. And so the case of Lindsay Clancy has me particularly interested for obvious reasons. But so I'm going to make this video for those of you who have any interest in this case. Let's talk about it. Okay, so in order to talk about the Lindsay Clancy case, which, just to give you the synopsis, in January 2003, Lindsay, I'm going to have to use the word unalived. I really don't like using it, but you do get a YouTube strike if you use other words that refer to anything violence related. So yes, unalived her 3 children and attempted to unalive herself. You can look at the details of the story. If you're here watching this, chances are you already know, so I'm not going to go through all the details of that story. What I'm more interested in is what the prosecution is contending, how the defense is going to build its case, and also the sort of court of public opinion. Now, I've been researching this case from the very beginning, but one of the things that I found particularly interesting was the interview in the New Yorker with Patrick Clancy, Lindsay's husband. Before I jump into the things that Patrick had said in this article, I have to talk about Andrea Yates a little bit, because Andrea Yates is the most famous case of postpartum psychosis gone to a very extreme degree, in which she unalived her 5 children. This is a really heartbreaking case. And when it first went to court, she was found guilty of murder 1, and she was sentenced to life in prison. Later, it was found out that there were some problems at her trial. You know, there's this idea that, like, if the person planned to do this crime, then they are guilty of it. And so we're going to talk about that, because it's not that black and white when we're dealing with a postpartum mood disorder, when we're dealing with psychosis, and specifically when we're dealing with postpartum psychosis. Okay, so a couple of things about Andrea Yates. In the 2006 trial, so that was the second trial for Andrea Yates, the jury, which was 6 men and 6 women, and they came up with their verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. Okay, so here we go. First thing that I wanted to quote that Patrick said was, "I wasn't married to a monster. I was married to someone who got sick." If you watched any of the coverage at the time, there was a lot of support from family and friends for Lindsay. Instead of it being like the rest of the reaction, which is, she's a monster, you know, throw away the key, put her in jail, give her the death penalty. You know, there were a lot of people who reacted that way. I think it's noteworthy that her entire community rallied around her. All the nurses that she worked with, tons of people wrote letters to the judge testifying to her personality and what a great nurse she was and what a wonderful mother she was. These are important things. So that was like the community, her co-workers, her family. I mean, her husband, that's very difficult to deal with. Now, there are probably many of you out there who have experienced, it's very common for women. It's 1 in 7 women experience a postpartum mood disorder, but that's typically depression or anxiety, usually anxiety. Sometimes it's OCD, sometimes there's intrusive thoughts. Slipping into psychosis is pretty rare. When it happens, it explodes all over the media, so it makes it look like it's something that can happen easily, but it doesn't. And I think it's really also noteworthy that every other industrialized or Western nation in the world treats filicide very differently than Americans do. We look at it straight up as a crime, and they look at it as like an obvious mental illness, because it's not normal for a mother to unalive her children. Okay, so one of the things that the interviewer asked Patrick was, when did you speak to Lindsay and how did that conversation go? It took him 6 months to actually speak to her on the phone. That's, how difficult it was for him to process, obviously. And when he did, the first thing he asked her was, did you plan this? Is that why you sent me out? And she said, no. It was just like, boom, like it just happened. It was, and that's what would describe a psychotic break. Apparently, she was hearing a voice that was telling her that this is what she needed to rescue them, which is interesting because that's exactly what Andrea Yates just said, that she did that to her children because she was saving them. Now, she had a lot of like religious overtones to her story, which Lindsay doesn't have, but still, that must be a terrifying thing to experience. Now, I'm sure there's going to be skeptics who are like, yeah, right. She didn't plan it. She sent her husband to go get food. She says that the answer for that is because he was working from home, she didn't want him to get involved in mixed up in rush hour traffic. She reports that she was having a good day, and so does Patrick. That's his memory. She was having a good day. He was working from home to more or less keep an eye on her. But you have to remember something. The fear was not that she was going to harm her children, but that she was going to be depressed enough to unalive herself. That's what they were worried about, not the other thing. So for all of those people who say he is responsible, he should be faulted, much the way they said that about Rusty Yates, Andrea Yates's husband, who kind of like continued to push her to have more children. In the recent documentary about Andrea Yates, he says, oh, I did not understand postpartum depression and certainly had no idea about postpartum psychosis. I thought it was something where it was like getting the flu. Like we would just give her some pills and she would feel better. So that's profoundly undereducated on the topic, okay? But that's his story, and that's like, 20 years ago. Patrick was not given that kind of information. He definitely didn't understand, neither did anybody. Otherwise, Lindsay would have been inpatient in one of those facilities. So she flew under the radar. Before I talk about that, I want to say one other thing. He also asked her, did you Google ways to kill? And she said, yes, I did, for myself. So again, if you're skeptical, you might be like, yeah, right, that didn't happen. But that sounds pretty plausible to me, that she could have been depressed enough to think like she needed to check out of life. There was a psychotherapist who was interviewed for the story, and she was talking about how just kind of our cultural norms, just sort of like societal myths about motherhood and expectations and the sort of mask of motherhood that people wear incentivize women to keep up this appearance of like everything's okay, everything's fine, this like sense of well-being. And that could lead healthcare providers to overlook much more serious psychiatric problems. Just think about that for a minute. So that's one of the very easy ways she could have slipped through the cracks. In addition to the sort of cocktail of medications she was giving, they're going to pay a lot of they're going to pay a lot of attention to that, because that is something that can contribute to the psychotic break. Lindsay was having trouble sleeping. She was on different medications. She was on anti-anxiety medication. She was on something for depression, obviously, something else for trying to get more sleep. Some delusions centered on newborns, including in a study about filicide, are linked to obsessional fears about the child's well-being. So we saw that in Lindsay, and we also saw that in a case of Cynthia Wackenheim. This was a story that I followed when it happened in 2012, because it happened in New York. She was a lawyer, she was educated, she was in her 40s, she was having her first baby, and she slipped into postpartum psychosis under everybody's radar. Nobody caught it with her, and she was obsessed with the idea that some little bumps and falls that her baby had had would render him unable to walk. That was her fear. And she heaped all of that blame and guilt upon herself. So she put her baby on her in a like Baby Bjorn style carrier, and she jumped out of the window of her apartment building in New York, and she landed in such a way that she was killed instantly and the baby survived. The father pointed out that the baby took his first steps a couple of weeks later. So, there again is another example of a mother thinking that they're doing some irreparable damage to their baby. And that starts out under the realm of postpartum anxiety. And then in some women where all the conditions are kind of like a perfect storm, it leads into psychosis. So this is what the defense is going to have to prove: that Lindsay was over-medicated, underdiagnosed, slipped through the radar, or was on some radar that just wasn't treating her efficiently, that she was given inappropriate medications or a combination of medications, and that no, she did not plan this out, or even if she had like a minor small plan for it, it doesn't matter. Andrea Yates had a plan for this too, and when interviewed, she said, I knew that I had to do what I was going to do. I was compelled to do it so that my children would go to heaven, but I also knew that other people would interfere with the plan. So you see how that could be like another contestable point? Women who commit filicide in the postpartum period in countries other than the US receive probation and mandated mental health care. Mandated care, not a prison sentence. 24 countries have legally defined infanticide as a less culpable form of M-word, recognizing the hormonal impact of pregnancy and childbirth. So what the law would refer to as an imbalance of the woman's mind. So the article wraps it up by basically saying that postpartum mental illness goes under the umbrella of like a very complex spectrum, and that when we're talking about the legal system, it's very binary. It's like sane, insane, guilty, not guilty, right? So doing a trial like this and expecting the public to kind of read through all of the medical data or have an understanding about the nuances might be a tall order, but hopefully this case will be yet another example, like Andrea Yates, that we really need to look at this through a different lens.